McDonald's is known for its golden arches and fast food, but what many people don't know is that, for some, this place holds dark secrets. Employees who worked early shifts, customers who walked by and more were seen, and specific unexplained who lived inside their kitchens. You are waiting to hear 5 frightening accounts of people who lived what no one would believe, except those who dared to work behind the scenes. Welcome to the channel where every ride could be your last. Here, we tell the darkest and most disturbing stories of drivers and passengers who have faced the unexplainable on the roads. If you like feeling that chill down your spine, subscribe now, hit the bell so you don't miss any chilling stories, and share them with your brave friends. Get ready, because the next race could be yours. The Midnight Customer. Part 1. Working at a 24-hour restaurant can be exhausting, but for Jordan, night shifts at her small town's McDonald's were a way to make extra money while studying. He never imagined that a simple night at work would turn into an experience that would leave him shaken forever. It all started on a particularly peaceful night. It was around midnight, and the McDonald's was empty. Jordan was left alone in the box, while his colleague Mia took care of cleaning in the kitchen. The environment was silent, except for the sporadic noise of the fryer and the constant hum of the fluorescent lights. He was almost dozing off when he heard the front door bell ring. A tall, thin man entered the restaurant. He wore an impeccable black suit, unusual for a customer at that time of night. What made him most uneasy, however, was the fact that the man was wearing sunglasses, even though it was midnight. Jordan looked around, waiting for the man to take off his glasses or do something, but he just stood there, motionless, at the counter. "Can I help?" Jordan said, trying to hide his discomfort. The man did not respond. He just stood there, with his head slightly tilted, as if he was observing something. Jordan looked at Mia, who also looked disconcerted. She shrugged, not knowing what to do. Finally, the man spoke, in a low, cold voice, "A Big Mac, please." Jordan processed the order quickly, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. He prepared the lunch and handed it to the man, who took the package without saying anything else. But instead of leaving, the man stopped in front of the counter. The silence that fell was suffocating. Jordan started to sweat. The clock behind the counter indicated that it had been 5 minutes since the man received his snack, but he didn't move. "Do you need anything else?" Jordan said, his voice tremendous. The man finally turned around, slowly walked to one of the tables in the far corner of the restaurant. He sat down and began unwrapping the snack with extremely slow movements. Jordan watched every move, feeling his stomach churn with nervousness. Mia moved away from Jordan, whispering, "This guy gives me the creeps. Something's wrong." Jordan selected. There was something disturbing about that figure, something he couldn't understand. They decided to leave him alone, but after a few minutes, something even stranger happened. The man spoke abruptly, leaving the snack untouched on the table, and walked out of the restaurant without saying a word. Curious, Jordan went to the table to see what he had left. When it was changed, he noticed that the Big Mac was exactly as it had been delivered, except for one detail. The burger was covered in maggots. Jordan took a step back, feeling his stomach turn. Mia, who was right behind him, quite surprising. Neither of them could understand what was happening. The snack, which had been prepared minutes before, was now completely infested. The putrid smell of rotting flesh began to fill the air. "That's not possible," Jordan muttered, still in shock. They knew something terrible was happening, but they were alone at this turning point, with no one to turn to. They decided to throw away the snack and try to forget the incident, but the feeling of discomfort. A few nights passed without anything else happening, but the feeling that they were being watched was not absent. Jordan started having nightmares about the man in the suit, always seeing those dark glasses and that disturbing smile. He would wake up in the middle of the night, in a cold sweat, with the image of that client engraved in his mind. Then, on another night on duty, the doorbell rang again at midnight sharp. Jordan automatically looked toward the entrance, and his heart stopped for a moment. It was him. The man in the suit was back. Mia, who was also working that night, turned pale when she saw him. They wanted to act naturally, but it was impossible. The man walked up to the counter just as slowly and ordered the exact same snack, a Big Mac, please. Jordan can barely process the order. He was shaking, his hands were sweaty. He prepared the snack as quickly as possible and handed it to the man, who once again sat at the same table, in the corner of the restaurant. This time, Jordan didn't want to wait to see what would happen. He told Mia he was going to call the manager and went to the back room. But when he returned with the manager, the man was gone. There was no sign of him, and the lunch was untouched on the table, no worms this time. The manager, irritated by the story, thought it was just a bad joke and reprimanded Jordan and Mia. "You're tired. Go home and rest," he said. But Jordan knew something was wrong. And he was right. The next night, Jordan couldn't help but grow panic as the clock approached midnight. Every second felt like an eternity, and he was sure the man would return. The manager, however, insisted that he work, saying that the story was nothing more than accumulated stress. When the bell rang exactly at midnight, Jordan almost fell out of his chair. The man in the suit was there again, standing in the doorway, with the same sunglasses and impassive expression. This time, however, something was different. He didn't move from the counter. Instead, he stood in the doorway, watching Jordan with increasing intensity. Jordan felt a sudden chill in the air, as if the temperature in the restaurant had instantly dropped. Mia was in the kitchen and hadn't seen the man enter. Jordan wanted to scream for her, but his voice didn't come out. He was frozen in fear, unable to move. The man took a step forward, and Jordan saw something that terrified him. The man's skin seemed to be peeling, as if he was rotting. The worms he had seen in the Big Mac now came out of the corners of the man's lips. Jordan felt his body shake with terror. The man then opened his mouth to speak, but the sound that came out was an icy whisper, "You should never have looked." Before he could react, the man disappeared as quickly as he had appeared. Jordan fell to the ground, panting, not believing what he had just seen. Mia ran through the kitchen when she heard the noise, and I found myself in shock. He can barely speak. The next day, Jordan asked for a mission. He never returned to that McDonald's, and the man in the suit was never seen again. However, reports from customers and employees who worked at the site in the following months have emerged. People said they saw a tall figure standing outside, always at midnight. Sometimes she would enter the restaurant, but no one could ever see her face. Others said that the smell of rotting meat began to permeate the place, without explanation. Jordan tried to move on with his life, but every time the clock struck midnight, he felt a shiver run down his spine. He knew that, somehow, the man in the suit was still there, waiting for him. The Cursed Kitchen. Kimberly was a young woman who had started working at McDonald's to save money to pay for college. She was fast and efficient, so she was soon promoted to head of the night team in the kitchen. The night shift was generally quieter, with few people passing through the restaurant, but this also made the work more monotonous. Over time, Kimberly began to feel too comfortable in that environment, until the night everything changed. It was a night like any other. The clock showed 1 a.m., and the restaurant's activity was practically at a standstill. She was in the kitchen, preparing what was left of the late-night orders. Only 2 colleagues were with her, Mark, who cleaned the floor in the burger preparation area, and Elisa, who waited on the counter. Kimberly noticed something strange when the fryer, which had just turned off, started making a loud, high-pitched sound. It looked like it was back on, even though no one had tried to activate it. She walked to the device, with her hands still greasy, and saw the oil boiling violently, as if something were happening while immersed in it. This is not normal, he thought. As she approached, she smelled a strong smell of burning meat, even though nothing had been placed in the fryer in the last few minutes. She tried to turn it off again, but the button seemed to be stuck. Kimberly called Mark to check, and he frowned, also finding everything very strange. "It seems that this device has a problem," he said. But before he could continue, something even stranger happened. The fryer turned off by itself, and the oil inside it suddenly became still, as if nothing had happened. Both were perplexed, but decided to carry on with their work, trying to forget what had happened. However, what seemed like a harmless mechanical problem would quickly turn into something much more frightening. As they continued their work, the strange events intensified. The kitchen lights began to flicker, and Kimberly heard a noise coming from the back of the kitchen, where the groceries were stored. She was checked, but I didn't find anything out of the ordinary. However, upon returning to the kitchen, I felt a strong sensation of being seen. With each passing minute, the atmosphere in the restaurant grew heavier. Kimberly couldn't concentrate. She felt inexplicably cold, even with all the ovens and fryers working. What bothered her most was that the smell of burning meat seemed to be intensifying, even though there was nothing being prepared at that moment. Then, suddenly, one of the bread boxes fell hard from the counter, scattering bread all over the floor. She ran to collect them, but when she bent down, she saw something that made her freeze. In the grease and dirt marks on the floor, there were footprints. But these footprints were not from ordinary shoes. They were disproportionate, with long fingers that ended in sharp marks, like claws. Kimberly tried to remain calm and called Mark to see. When he arrived, his face turned pale. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, as he analyzed the footprints. "Did anyone stop by?" I don't know," Kimberly replied, tremendously. The discomfort in the kitchen increased by the second, and the smell was now unbearable. It was then that Elisa spoke from the counter. "Kim, you need to see this." Kimberly and Mark ran to the front of the restaurant. Elisa was pale, her eyes wide, pointing at the security camera monitor. What they saw made them hold their breath. In the camera footage, we could see the kitchen, and everything looked normal. Except for one thing, there was a hunched, shadowy figure moving in the far corner, where no one had been. The figure was faceless and appeared to be floating, its elongated arms reaching down to the ground. She moved with disturbing slowness, as if she were dragging something. Is this real?" Elisa murmured, her hands shaking. Kimberly felt her stomach drop. Fear rose in his chest. But before he appeared to buy what he was selling, the figure removed from the camera, and the monitor became static. That night had turned into a real nightmare. Kimberly tried calling the manager, but the lines were dead. panic began to take over them. Mark, trying to remain calm, suggested they leave the restaurant and wait until their shift was over. "This is some kind of joke," he said, trying to convince himself. But Kimberly knew it wasn't a joke. Something was wrong, and that smell of burning flesh continued to fill the air. Suddenly, the fire alarm went off. The three jumped in fright when the screeching sound echoed through the kitchen and living room. They ran into the kitchen, expecting to see fire or smoke, but there was nothing. The fryer, however, was bubbling again, as if something was being fried. Mark moved and turned off the device once again. As soon as he did so, a loud, piercing scream filled the air. Everyone froze in fear, looking back. The scream seemed to come from all directions, and the entire restaurant began to shake. The sound continued, and Kimberly, overcome with panic, said, "We need to get out of here, now." They ran to the exit, but when they reached the door, it didn't open. Mark tried to force the door open, but it appeared to be locked from the inside. The scream, which was now louder and more disturbing, continued to echo through the kitchen. Kimberly turned to the windows, but when she looked through the glass, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The figure he had seen on the cameras was outside, standing in front of the window. Its long, shapeless arms reached down to the ground, and where its face should have been, there was only a shadow. The figure began to slowly approach, passing by the window, as if it were effortlessly passing through the glass. Kimberly tried to recover, but she was paralyzed with fear. The figure moves towards her, its arms reaching towards her. The smell of burning flesh was unbearable now, and the sound of screaming filled his head. "Run, Elisa," pulling Kimberly by the hand. They ran back to the kitchen, trying to find a way out, but there was nowhere to go. Mark, who was still trying to open the door, looked back and saw the figure approaching. "What do you want?" He was confused, in despair. But the figure did not respond. Instead, her arms reached out even further, and she quickly moved toward Mark. Before he could react, the figure's arms wrapped around his body, and he was dragged into the darkness. Kimberly and Elisa heard Mark's scream echoing through the kitchen, but they couldn't do anything. They ran to the back of the restaurant, where there was an emergency exit. Kimberly forced the door, and this time, it opened. The two ran outside, without looking back. They ran until they were far from the restaurant, the sound of Mark's scream still echoing in their minds. When they finally stopped, panting, Kimberly looked at Elisa, who suffered a shock. "What was that?" Elisa whispered, unable to understand what she had just experienced. Kimberly had no answers. "All I knew was that kitchen was cursed. Something evil lived in that place, and it wasn't the first time it had claimed victims." The next day, the restaurant was closed for maintenance. No one ever knew what happened to Mark, and the security camera didn't record anything unusual. The manager claimed it was just a misunderstanding, but Kimberly and Elisa knew the truth. They never went back to McDonald's. And, to this day, the smell of burning flesh haunts them, reminding them of that terrifying night. The Order Never Made. Part 1. Daniel was a young college student who ended up getting a job at the local McDonald's. He was used to working the night shift, which was usually quiet. He liked the idea of being able to study during quieter times and still earn extra money. Most of the customers were night drivers, people passing through, or, occasionally, a group of friends leaving a party. Nothing out of the ordinary. However, there was one specific night that Daniel could never forget, and it was what led him to leave that job for good. It was a cold, rainy November night. Daniel was at the counter, while his colleague Sophie cleaned the floor in the customer area. The restaurant was empty except for an elderly woman who was sitting by the window. She had been there since 10 o'clock at night, just looking out the window without making a single request. Daniel found it strange, but didn't try to make much of it. He moved in around 11:30 a.m. I asked, wondering if she would like to order something. "Can I help you with anything, ma'am?" he said with a smile. The woman slowly turned her head to look at him. His face was pale, and his eyes, deep and empty, showed no emotion. Daniel felt a shiver run down his spine, but he maintained his composure. "I already asked," she replied calmly. Daniel frowned. He was sure that no one had attended to that woman. He looked around and noticed that Sophie was also looking at a woman, looking equally disconcerted. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, trying to be polite. "But I don't think anyone responded to your request. Can I write it down now?" The woman did not respond immediately. Instead, she just slowly turned her head back to the window, continuing to watch the rain outside. Daniel waited for a few seconds, but it was clear that the conversation was over. He walked back to the counter, not knowing what to think. "That was really weird," Sophie commented when he moved. "She said she already asked," Daniel replied, still confused. "But no one answered her." "And did you see her eyes?" Sophie nodded, visibly uncomfortable. "Yeah, there's something strange about this woman." However, as there wasn't much to do, they both went back to work, waiting for the woman to leave. But she didn't go. Midnight arrived, and the woman was still there, sitting in the same place, staring out. Daniel decided he didn't want to bother her anymore, so he left it alone. The restaurant was silent, except for the occasional noise from the soda machine or the muffled children from the rain hitting the window. The calm was interrupted when the front door bell rang. Daniel looked at the entrance, expecting to see a customer coming in, but the door was completely closed. He met a confused look with Sophie. "Did you see that?" she said. "I swear I heard the door." Daniel found it, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. "It must be the wind," he said, trying to convince himself. However, the feeling that something was wrong did not leave him. About half an hour later, the doorbell rang again. This time it was a longer ring, as if someone had slowly opened the door. Daniel looked back at the entrance, but once again, there was no one there. "This is getting weird," Sophie muttered. As they tried to understand what was happening, the security camera monitor flickered, and one of the cameras showed something strange. The external camera for the restaurant's entrance, which had previously been empty, showed the door being slowly opened. But there was no one. The chill down Daniel's spine worsened. He declared himself and went to the door to check, but it was locked. "That doesn't make sense," he said out loud. Sophie stirred, also intrigued. When I returned to the counter, the monitor flickered again. Now, the camera has shown something even more disturbing. There was a shadowy figure standing in the middle of the restaurant, in the seating area, but neither Daniel nor Sophie could see anything with the naked eye. The figure stood still, motionless, and the environment around it seemed deformed, as if the light itself was distorted. Daniel felt his blood run cold in his veins. He knew something was deeply wrong in that restaurant. As soon as we started processing what we were selling, the camera monitor was completely disabled. The restaurant fell into an almost unearthly silence. Daniel looked at Sophie, who was pale with fear. "This isn't right," she said in a shaky voice. Daniel tried to remain calm, but his mind was racing a mile a minute. He decided to go to the kitchen, thinking there might be a problem with the security system. But as he walked towards the back, something made him stop. The air around him seemed to have grown heavier, and he felt a presence. When he turned around, he saw the elderly woman still sitting at the same table, but now with a disturbing smile on her face. His eyes, which were once empty, now sparkle with an evil light. "I've already placed my order," she repeated, her voice drawn out and sinister. Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. He tried to speak, but the words just wouldn't come out. He knew he was no longer dealing with an ordinary situation. Something much darker was at play. It was then that the kitchen radio turned on by itself, playing strange, distorted music. Sophie spoke from the front area, and Daniel ran over to her. "The door is opening," she mentioned, pointing to the entrance. The restaurant's door was actually secretly opening, as if someone invisible was entering. The figure they saw on the monitor, which had previously been motionless, now appeared to be crossing the restaurant's entrance, but they could not physically see it. Daniel felt panic rising inside him. He took out his cell phone and tried to call the police, but the signal was completely down. That night, which was once a peaceful calm, turns into an inexplicable nightmare. Time seemed to be dragging on, and with each passing minute the fear that dominated them increased. The elderly woman remained standing in the same position, now with an even more disturbing smile on her face. Daniel and Sophie were trapped, not knowing what to do or where to run. "We have to get out of here," Sophie said in a shaky voice, but Daniel hesitated. He felt that somehow leaving was no longer an option. Suddenly, all the lights in the restaurant flickered, and the radio became louder, almost deafening. The kitchen door opened with a bang, and the shadowy figure they had seen on the cameras was now closer, clearly visible to both of them. She had no defined shape, she was just a shadow, but her power to frighten was undeniable. The figure slowly advanced, and the elderly woman began to laugh, a grotesque and terrifying sound. Daniel felt his legs tremble, and Sophie began to cry. It was then that, out of nowhere, everything stopped. The lights dimmed, the radio turned off, and the woman disappeared. The shadowy figure disappeared as if it had never existed. The restaurant fell silent again. Daniel and Sophie, still shaking, ran to the exit. "When I left McDonald's, the air felt lighter, but the trauma of what they experienced that night never left them." The next morning, Daniel returned to the restaurant to say goodbye. He couldn't continue working there. As he left, he looked one last time at the table where the woman had sat, and the chair was still looking promising, as if someone had planned to get up. He knew that, somehow, that request she said she had made would never be completed. The night shift at the drive-thru. Alex has always been a calm guy. He didn't mind working at McDonald's at night, as the night shift was generally calmer and without the chaos of rush hours. The problem is that, with a lack of movement, boredom took over, and time seemed to pass more slowly. But there was a night when Alex would give anything to return to that monotonous boredom. It was a Thursday, around 2 a.m. The drive-thru was empty except for the soft sound of the radio playing in the back of the kitchen. Alex was on the phone, asking questions on the phone, while Lenny, his colleague, took care of cleaning the service area. They didn't expect any more customers until early in the morning, and most of the work was already done. Suddenly, the drive-thru intercom rang, saying there was a customer in line. Alex ordered immediately and walked to the reception desk. "Welcome to McDonald's, may I take your order?" he said in his polite and mechanical tone, which had already become a habit. But there was no response. Alex waited a few seconds, thinking that perhaps the customer was distracted or adjusting the order. I tried again. Hello? Need more time? Still, the silence. He looked out the window but didn't see any cars. Strange, he thought. Maybe the customer gave up and walked away without saying anything. Just as I was about to return to the counter, the intercom sound returned, but this time the noise was different. It wasn't the sound of a voice or someone trying to speak, it was a low, slurred sound, almost like a whisper, but he couldn't make out what was being said. Alex frowned and looked at Lenny, who had also noticed the strangeness. "What was that?" Lenny asked, looking confused. "I don't know. Maybe it's some kind of interference," Alex replied, although he wasn't part of his own explanation. Once again, he looked out the drive-thru window. There were no cars, no signs of movement. The street was completely deserted, and the early morning darkness made everything even more sinister. Alex returned to the intercom and asked again, "Do you need help with your order?" Suddenly, a clearer sound emerged from the other side. A voice, low and husky, replied, "He's coming." Alex froze. The voice was cold, distant, and disturbing. He felt a shiver run down his spine, and for a second, he didn't know how to respond. Who's coming?" he said hesitantly. But there was no response. Lenny, who was watching everything closely, took a step towards Alex. "Man, that was bizarre." "Who said that?" Alex shook his head, still processing what he had just heard. "I don't know. There's no one out there. It must be someone trying to play a prank." The two remained silent for a few seconds, trying to understand what had happened. But before he could say anything else, the intercom rang again, interrupting his thoughts. Alex took a deep breath and answered once again. "Welcome to McDonald's, may I take your order?" This time, the response was immediate, but it wasn't the kind of response he was expecting. The same hoarse voice, cold and devoid of emotion, whispered, "You are not alone." Alex's blood ran cold. He looked at Lenny, and they were both now on full alert. Lenny arrived at a drive-thru window to check if there were any cars they weren't selling, but the street remained deserted. "This is getting really weird," Lenny said, his voice full of tension. Alex coincidentally felt panic starting to take over. He looked back at the drive-thru monitor and suddenly saw something that made him catch his breath. In the corner of the screen, where before there was nothing, there was now a dark figure standing at the edge of the camera's view. It was impossible to make out details, the figure was just a shadow with no defined shape. She was still, as if she was waiting. Alex didn't know what to do. Fear paralyzed him, and he felt a sense of imminent danger. "Are you selling this?" Alex whispered to Lenny. Lenny looked at the monitor and went pale. "Man, this can't be happening. There's no one out there." But the figure was there, and they knew it. Time seemed to slow down, and the silence in the restaurant was suffocating. Alex felt his heart pound, and he knew he needed to act, but fear kept him stuck in place. The figure on the camera didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming. "Let's get out of here," Lenny suggested, but his voice was shaking. "That's not normal." Before Alex could respond, the figure on the camera finally moved. Slowly, she began walking towards the restaurant, each step making it more visible. Even without clear details, Alex knew something was deeply wrong with this. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. He and Lenny watched, unable to look away. The continuous figure approached until it disappeared from the camera's field of view, as if it had merged into the darkness. Fear took over them both. It was as if the air around them had grown denser, heavier. Suddenly, the intercom rang, and the same voice whispered, "He's here." At this moment, the lights in the restaurant flickered, and a loud and strange sound echoed through the kitchen, as if something had been knocked over with force. Alex and Lenny ran to check, but nothing was out of place. However, the feeling that they were not alone was unbearable. It was then that they heard the sound of the drive-thru door opening on its own. Alex froze. The cold early morning wind invaded the restaurant, and the door swayed slightly, as if it had been pushed by an invisible force. "This can't be happening," Lenny muttered, not knowing what to do. The atmosphere in the restaurant was suffocating. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the occasional sound of the drive-thru door slamming against the wall. Alex and Lenny knew something was there with them, but they couldn't see it. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, and a loud sound came from the intercom. This time, the voice wasn't a whisper. It was loud, distorted, and full of rage. "You can't escape." Panic took over Alex. He ran to the control panel, trying to turn off the intercom, but nothing worked. The sound continued, and seemed to fill every corner of the restaurant. Lenny, in desperation, tried to lock the drive-thru door, but it seemed locked, as if an invisible force was hiding it. It was then that the figure appeared again, this time inside the restaurant. She was in the far corner, near the food preparation area. Alex saw the relaunch as he tried to turn off the intercom. It was an elongated shadow, and its presence or air with a sense of imminent death. Lenny spoke, trying to escape through the front door, but before he could reach the exit, something grabbed him. Alex transformed in time to see Lenny being dragged away by the shadowy figure. Lenny's scream echoed throughout the restaurant, until silence once again dominated the room. Alex was paralyzed with fear. He knew that if he didn't get out of there, he would be next. He ran to the exit, feeling the early morning chill cut into his skin. As he left the restaurant, he didn't look back. He ran to his car and went as fast as he could, without ever stopping to see if he was being followed. The next morning, Alex asked for a mission. He never returned to McDonald's, and Lenny was never found. What happened that night is still a mystery, but Alex knows that something dark lives in that restaurant's drive-thru. And, to this day, he hears the whisper in his head, "He's coming." The ghost calling in the kitchen. Emily has always enjoyed her job at McDonald's, even if it was just a way to pay the bills while studying for her nursing degree. She used to work the morning shift, but during a week of staff shortages, she was moved up to cover the night shift in the kitchen. Despite not being a fan of the longer, quieter nights, she accepted the job. After all, it was only for a week. But after what happened those nights, Emily never went back to work at the restaurant. It was a Tuesday, around 1:30 in the morning. The restaurant was empty. The night shift always tends to be like this, especially during a week. Only Emily, Jared, who was at the cashier, and Olivia, her friend who worked cleaning, were on duty. Emily was in the kitchen, organizing orders and cleaning surfaces, when she heard the kitchen phone ring. This is surprising since the phone rarely rang, and when it did, it was usually the manager calling to give instructions. But at that time, there was no point in anyone calling. Emily dried her hands and answered. "McDonald's, how can I help you?" The silence on the other end of the line was the first thing that bothered her. She heard a heavy recovery, almost as if someone was there but didn't want to speak. "Hello," she repeated, now with a touch of impatience. But again, there was no response. just breathing, increasingly unsettling. She hung up the phone, thinking it might have been a mistake. But the discomfort of that bizarre call didn't leave her alone. "What was it?" said Jared, who had noticed her look of confusion when he hung up the phone. "No one. I just heard breathing on the other side." "It must have been a joke or something," Emily replied, trying to shake off the feeling of uneasiness. However, about 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. Emily looked at the device, hesitantly, before answering. "McDonald's, how can I help you?" This time, there was something different. On the other end of the line, a low, husky voice replied, "You shouldn't be there." Emily froze. His mind tried to plan what was happening. Who was calling? And why would anyone say something like that? "Who's talking?" she said, her voice shaking a little. But once again, silence and heavy breathing filled the space. She hung up the phone quickly, feeling her heart race in her chest. She went to Jared and told him what had just happened. He laughed, trying to ease the tension. Probably some drunk trying to play a prank. "I don't care," he said, returning to the box. Emily tried to get on with her work, but that phone call kept echoing in her mind. And what she didn't know was that that was just the beginning. About half an hour later, the phone rang again. This time, Emily didn't want to answer, but something inside her pushed her to reach for the phone. "I warned you, you weren't supposed to be there," said the same hoarse voice, before she could even speak. Emily hung up immediately and looked at Jared with wide eyes. "It's him again," he whispered. Jared frowned. "It's getting weird." "Maybe we should call the manager," he suggested, but before he could act, the phone rang for the 4th time that night. The sound echoed through the empty kitchen, and the fear Emily now felt was palpable. But Jared presented a solution to the situation, sent to respond. "Listen here, if you're trying to joke, this is over now," Jared on the phone. However, his expression changed significantly upon hearing the other side's response. His face turned pale, and he dropped the phone, which fell to the floor with a thud. "What it was?" asked Emily, frightened by his occurrence. I heard my own voice." He repeated what I said," Jared murmured in disbelief. "How is this possible?" Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. She picked up the phone from the floor and, putting it to her ear, realized the line was dead. There was no one on the other side. Just silence. After that last phone call, the atmosphere in the restaurant changed. The air grew heavier, as if something invisible was lurking, watching their every move. Emily looked around and noticed even the dimmer lights flickering occasionally. That's when Olivia returned from the cleaning area, her face visibly troubled. "Guys, you won't believe it," she began. "I heard someone calling me while I was cleaning the women's bathroom. I thought it was a customer, but when I went to check, there was no one there." Jared and Emily exchanged scared looks. "Was it a low voice?" Emily asked, feeling her stomach turn. "Yes," Olivia replied. "It sounded like a whisper." Emily and Jared told Olivia about mysterious phone calls. The look of fear on Olivia's face confirmed what everyone was thinking, but no one had the courage to say. Something was very wrong in that place. They decided to lock the restaurant doors, even though there were still a few hours until the end of the shift. "I don't want to take risks." But when Emily went to the door to lock it, she heard the phone ring again. She stopped, her hand shaking on the doorknob, and looked at Jared. "Don't answer," he said, his voice filled with dread. But Emily knew that if she didn't answer, the feeling of pleasure would only grow. She picked up the phone, her heart in her throat, and put it to her ear. "You can't run away," said the hoarse voice. "I am here." The phone fell out of Emily's hand, and the line went dead again. The feeling that something was close, very close, filling the kitchen. They were trapped there with something. The clock seemed to have stopped. Every second felt like an eternity as the trio tried to process what was happening. The restaurant, once a familiar and safe environment, now seemed to be swallowed by an invisible darkness. Suddenly, the lights began to flash violently, and the kitchen radio, which had been turned off, turned on by itself, playing distorted, almost inaudible music. Emily knew something was about to happen. He was charged with electricity, and her instincts screamed at her to flee. But before you could take any action, the kitchen door opened with a bang. A cold draft passed through the restaurant, causing everyone to turn around at the same time. There, at the entrance to the kitchen, stood a figure. It wasn't human. It was a tall, twisted shadow with long, thin arms. Its eyes, or what appeared to be eyes, glowed with a dim, sinister light. "He's here," the voice whispered again, echoing in Emily's mind even though the phone was off the hook. Jared tried to run, but before he could take 2 steps, the shadowy figure quickly moved towards him, crossing the ground as if floating. He was grabbed by the shadow, which grabbed him from the ground with a force that shouldn't have been possible. Jared spoke, but his scream was interrupted by the terrifying silence of the kitchen. Emily and Olivia were paralyzed with fear, unable to move or scream. They watched as the figure carried Jared into the darkness of the kitchen, and then all was silent. Olivia started crying, and Emily, in shock, knew they needed to get out of there. She took Olivia by the hand and, without looking back, ran to the front door. When they reached the exit, the lights flickered one last time, and the restaurant was plunged into total darkness. Emily and Olivia ran out of the restaurant, panting and panicking. The cold air of the early morning hit them, but the feeling of security they expected to feel never came. They looked back at McDonald's and saw that the phone light was still blinking, as if someone was calling again. Fear continued to pulse through their veins as they got into the car and drove away, never looking back. The next day, Emily did not return to work. She knew she could never set foot in that place again. When the manager was told what happened, he just exploded strangely. "This is nothing new," he said, casually. "You're not the first to go through this." She never heard from Jared again. He disappeared that night, and no one in the restaurant could explain how or why. Security cameras showed nothing, and records of the mysterious calls were erased. Emily moved away from that town, but the ghostly connections were never left. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, she still hears the phone ringing. And even though she knows she shouldn't answer, a part of her always hears that voice echoing in her mind, "You shouldn't be there." Did you like this story? Do you have something incredible to share? If you or someone you know has had a hair-raising experience in traffic, whether as a driver or passenger, send your story. Who knows, it might appear in our next video. Send your report in the comments or by email, and let's explore the mysteries of the road together.